All right, everyone. Well, welcome to part one of a four-part series on unlocking cannabis genetics for quality and consistency. Today, we're going to be discussing one of my favorite topics, one of the most important topics as it comes to cannabis quality. That's genetics. So, as global competition is on the rise and price compressions become a reality, focusing on product quality is one of the most important things that you can ever experience, right? So, genetics being that foundation of quality, we brought in three experts and good buds of mine to help us discuss quality and genetics. So, today we had the pleasure of introducing good friend Ben Lind from Humboldt Seed Company, as well as Kevin Jodrey from Wonderland Nursery in Ganjier, and my good friend Taylor Kirk from Fluence and 4K Farm to help us unlock the mystery of quality in cannabis and genetics. So Ben, let's hear a little bit about yourself.
Oh, hey. My name is Benjamin Lind. One of the owners of Humboldt Seed Company. My family's been growing and breeding cannabis since, my aunts and my uncles back in the day. So I kind of was exposed to it at a really young age. And, I've never thought, that we would be, having these kinds of conversations online. This is pretty amazing to be able to share kind of the work and the passion that me and my family have been doing for a minute now, and being able to talk about everything from the cutting edge of what's new in breeding to just kind of the old school traditional way of like large scale pheno hunting. So yeah, every year we do large pheno hunts here in California and in some other places in the world as well now that it's opening up, looking at tens of thousands of plants trying to find unicorns.
That's rad. Kevin, let's hear a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me on. Career cultivator, propagator, co-founder of Cookies Research and Development, where all the genes for Cookies Global get developed and trialed. Co-founder of the Ganjier, which is a cannabis sommelier program, and small farmer.
Small farmer with a big heart. Taylor, let's hear a little bit about yourself.
All right. Thanks, Casey. And thanks everyone for joining. So I'm a cultivation advisor for Fluence, and I also own a craft hemp farm, I like to call it, in Texas. So I've been in Texas agriculture for 25 years. I've been a cannabis advocate most of my life, and I've been working on breeding type 2 genetics most recently, but type 3s, type 2s primarily. Have a medical background. I used to work for one of the licensed medical producers in the state, and I did some breeding for them as well. So I've come at the genetics side from a primarily medicinal side, and look forward to chatting with you guys about that. 4K Farm, owned by my wife and I. It's just a family-owned, operated small business, and we focus on premium quality flower.
Brad, thanks, Taylor. So when we look at quality in cannabis genetics, we've broken this down into kind of three main buckets, right? And this first one is a really important one to not only the breeders, but also the cultivators growing the genetics, and for the consumers to understand what it takes and what goes into creating these genetics for the market, is the cultivation considerations. So first question we got for you, Ben. It's really around selecting for traits and the data that goes behind selecting for traits. And I know you guys do a lot of phenotyping and some massive pheno hunts. What are some of the things that you look for as far as growth traits, and then how do you collect that data?
Yeah, it's a great first question. I guess when you're looking for any traits, you're always kind of looking for like, what is the application for this? Like, so is it for indoor? Is it for outdoor? Who's the end consumer? Like, what boxes are we trying to check here? Like, is it about production? Is it about, percent or potency? So there's tons of different considerations. We developed a rating sheet based on kind of what's been used a lot in like the fisheries industry for doing fish counts and identifying different traits within river systems. So we adapted that to cannabis. So we have, I think right now we have it pared down to 27 different points that we give numerical ratings to, whether it's color, aesthetic, smell, um, just all the key points that we're looking for. And then from that data, we can, pull out the applications. But with all that homework we do, I think the biggest thing that I personally see in the fields when you're doing pheno hunts is that people kind of just gravitate to the plants that speak to them. So even though we have all this, research and science and data driven influences on our, breeding now, really it comes down to like, what do people like, what plants resonate with certain individuals for specific reasons. So like all in all, at the end of the day, it's really like what plants are people, hanging out around talking about.
That's awesome. Yeah, because when you breed, you're really breeding for kind of a multitude of cultivation scenarios, right? Not only are you breeding for people that are growing indoors, but also, in greenhouses and outdoors. And so it seems like having all those, considerations and traits and logged as data really helps you determine what's going to best be cultivated by people, in many different markets.
Yeah, there's so many applications, and especially today with, especially with the THCA market now, opening up, and, before that it was, compliant hemp. So it was really driven around potency numbers and, compliance issues that were have been put on the plant. So, there's just, yeah, so many buckets to fill, like whether it's something that's, purple gas candy for like the designer kind of Instagram cannabis market, or if it's for like the compliant hemp market, or for an indoor scenario, or even now what we're seeing a lot is people looking more and more at sustainability. So looking at a variety that is going to check the boxes, but also, have the least amount of inputs needed to bring that cultivar to market.
Right. And as the industry is kind of change and rapidly evolving, have you seen many differences in what people are looking for as far as, preferable traits for cultivation?
I mean, yeah, now it's all, there's a heavy push towards potency still, which, everybody wants, higher potency, stronger, faster. Yeah, more stronger, faster is what everybody always wants. And, and purple, like the purple candy gas, that's a box that has been, a big one
Yeah.
for the past probably 3 years. We're seeing it kind of move now to like a real resurgence in kind of some traditional genetics. So like some genetics that had really been kind of left in the wake of legalization, that are now people are like, hey, I actually want this. I want to be, have access to these old school OGs, or, train
Mm-hmm.
wrecks, or even strains that like Blue Dream that, 15 years ago was grown to the point where no one wanted it. So everybody had 10 different names for their Blue Dream strain. Um, but now you're seeing a real resurgence in that, and it's more from the customer demand side than it is from like the broker side. So for the
Right.
longest time you had brokers setting the flavor profile, and now with legalization, you have more and more like the voice of the people is becoming louder and louder, which is amazing, because that's who ultimately is consuming this.
Right. That totally makes sense. Not just the cultivator, but the end consumer, which is what ultimately drives the market, you know? Um, that's great. Kev, this next question is for you. So genetic material, obviously, when you're producing genetics or selling genetics, there's multiple ways to introduce it to the market. Seeds is obviously, one that most breeders introduce to the market. But then there's also this culture, which has been one of my favorite things to see over the years, of clones, of trading clones, selling clones, holding onto clones of old genetics, whether that be, traditional propagation methods or tissue culture. What do you see as far as, the difference between focusing on seed production or clone production and how that interacts with the market?
Well, it's been interesting just because, historically, if we go back, to the beginning of, like, say, North America cannabis, like say 68, with, cultivation methodology, everything was seed driven. And customers were happy that they got really good product and they could deal with deviation. But once we got into the, the illicit era where everything was driven really, indoor, it standardized and stabilized products in a way that customers had never experienced. So they became familiar with consistency in every batch. And not to the degree we have today, but it was the beginning of it. And seeds took a back seat in production and was only, for like hunting or working with some, outdoor crop. But you're starting to see some of the changes again, where the development of stabilized F1 seed allows you to be able to run from seed. So I think over the next couple of years, it's going to be interesting because you'll start to really clearly see seed as a choice for commercial crop considerations or clonal. And I think that with clonal, it's outliers. It's that when you run through a population looking for something, you have a clear idea of what it is you hope will come out. But often that's not what you get. You'll find things that are in the hunt, but they weren't what you expected. And you're like, okay, this plant really stacks up well for a live resin, right? And this one's a live rosin, and this one's flower. And this one right here is meant for export because it can handle vibrational change and temperature change. So clones kind of let you find things that are really, really hard to get in a stabilized seed to that degree of specificity. So I don't think the clone market's ever going to disappear fully. And I think that what really makes things pop in a market is the duality of the market, meaning that people who aren't in licensed cannabis can play with the genes. So if there's seeds connected to the clone, I think it's just phenomenal for both parties, because people who want to be able to tap into the hype that's publicized can benefit. And when the mainstream is touching it privately, then they're made aware. Then when they go to the store, they can ask. So to me, you have to create a situation where nobody choke holds the entirety of it. So like, I think with the development and the IP costs, you have to be able to have licensing and control of your genomics, just because there's no way you can spend this much time and money. But there has to be some release connected to it that lets the public get to play too. Right. And then what you have is really a healthy cannabis culture, which drives healthy cannabis sales.
Absolutely. That totally makes sense. And I've seen, in my own facilities and a lot of other facilities, it's important for people to get up and growing quickly as possible, and clones really allow that opportunity to happen. But then developing and hunting for your own specific traits and genetics that define your brand and define your company based on your market, is super important. So, what I'm hearing a lot is, one's not necessarily better than the other, but they both come with their advantages depending on what you're trying to do, and then like you said, seeds have come a long way, since back in the day as far as consistency in those F1s, and so now you can pop a multitude of seeds and have, relatively similar growth traits and habits within those, beyond what we saw before. Absolutely. So Tay, this next one's for you. Importance of environmental influence on selections. We all know that every little change in the environment that we're cultivating in changes what the plant does. And if we're breeding and trying to select based on growth traits, how much does the environment affect or influence those growth traits?
Oh, it's huge. So, we talk about phenotype hunting. Phenotype is the genotype's expression in the environment, right, that it's observed. So you could have a genotype express itself differently outdoors than in a greenhouse than indoors. And then you can look at indoors and you can look at different lighting, different controlled environmental management as well, and see subtle differences in how it might perform there. So yeah, the environment's is huge, and that's a big part of what I do at Fluence is helping growers understand the optimum environment for LEDs, but it comes down to the genetics, and we've talked a lot about things like photo bleaching. There are genetics that are more sensitive to that, high light intensity. And I know from my own experience, the breeding that I've done, When I hunt in the greenhouse is where I primarily start everything. Is I do my first hunt in the greenhouse and then I go hunt it indoors, and I end up with an understanding of, okay, this genetic is going to be my preferred indoor plant in my operation, and this one's going to be my preferred greenhouse plant for different reasons. Could be yields are better in the greenhouse than for other plants would be better indoors. Insect resistance, certain terpene profiles, aromatic compounds that prevent the insect infestations that other crops might get. So yeah, I mean the environment's huge, and again, it's the two pieces to what makes up a phenotype, and what ultimately is Kevin mentioned. These clones that we're keeping and cherishing are a selection from a specific environment.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Ben, in all the breeding that you guys have done, have you noticed much of a difference in the genetics and how they perform based on the conditions that you selected them in to the conditions that, the customers that are purchasing your seeds are growing them in?
I mean, yeah, it definitely does vary, and there is a lot of potential for variation to occur, for cultural reasons. So like, the climate of the greenhouse, the latitude where it's grown outdoors, various expressions can be pumped out. I think probably one of the better examples of that would be the grow off, that competition where we
Right.
had we had a specific clone that was released nationwide and grown by hundreds of different growers, and every type of facility, from indoor facilities to a backyard grow to everything in between. And to see like not only like the cannabinoid profile being greatly shifted as far as just overall potency, to the actual like terpene expressions, and seeing like different samples, and they're all genetically tested and shown that they were the same sample was turned in, that was given. But to see the actual, what blew me away is to see like strains that for me when I grow them are like caryophyllene dominant with maybe a hint of myrcene, but then to see this myrcene brought out by other cultivators, and it just the 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 buds to smell drastically different than what I had
Yeah.
ever experienced. So I think there's a lot to be said with that, and there's specific genetics that really fit different molds. So there is a specific genetic to that works really well for the Caribbean, and it could be a caryophyllene dominant, like kind of OG Kush analog, but it's kind of put into a plant that is, or put on top of a plant that it's going to perform well in the Caribbean, versus one that is going to have the same chemical and profile but is appropriate for more like northern latitudes, like in Canada.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That's awesome. Um, So that was kind of the first bucket, the cultivation consideration from the viewpoint of the breeder, right? Now, one of the next aspects is the cultivator who's going to be growing it for the market. So we have the breeder who's selecting, then the cultivator who chooses that seed, to then grow it for the market. And on this one, we're going to start with Ben, right? So genetic stability, this is kind of something that we've talked about, a few times, has been brought up, is kind of a stable point, when we're talking a staple point when we're talking about genetics. How important is genetic stability for the cultivators that are producing for the market?
I would say it's probably the number one most important thing, to know that, hey, if I plant these 10,000 seeds, at the end of my cycle, I'm going to be able to put them all into the same bag and into the same batch for testing. So it's something we really pride ourselves on as far as when we release something for commercial growing, is it's like, yeah, this is ready, that, you can do it on a large scale and it's going to be repeatable. And not only that, but also for the indoor, like the smaller, like tent grows, to know if you're like, hey, I'm going to put, 6 of these plants in my tent, that at the end of the day, I'm going to have, a couple of pounds that I'm going to be able to put into the same bag. And it's not going to be, oh, I have 3 ounces of this phenotype, 2 ounces of this phenotype, or even worse, on a large scale, having to go through a field and, divide your field into, okay, these are this phenotype, they're going to go this way, and these ones are this other phenotype, they're going to go that way. So yeah, breeding a stable, predictable seed line is definitely probably the number one thing for when it comes to large scale cultivation, because from there you can really go anywhere. It's like if you can stabilize a phenotype to have, you know, one population that's going to be of that aesthetic and testing, that you can really go anywhere with it. You can always just bring, if as long as you have that kind of, as long as you have that down, you can kind of just like cut and paste that onto different varieties.
Totally, you know, and I know from you know, a lot of the genetics that I've grown in the past, sometimes that stability or the instability comes out after your, you know, 5,000th clone that you've done, you know, and you may have had an HVAC issue in your mother's room when you were doing that, you know. So I know that stability is really sometimes a challenge for cultivators if that genetic is already kind of towing the line, you know, between beautiful or an absolute nightmare.
Oh yeah, and within clones too. Yeah, there's so much potential for genetic drift, or like kind of stressful events, or you know, either viral baggage to jump on board, and then you're 30 generations in, and all of a sudden you have a whole new, you know, essentially a whole new clone coming out. It's, you know,
Right.
the bud smaller, the testing's off, so being able to track that and start with as clean a stock as possible, as close to the source as possible, is kind of probably the number one way to hedge that bet.
Yeah, and you guys do a lot of work internationally too with your genetics, which kind of, you know, opens up the game to different markets beyond what the North America market has always focused on. You know, and I know there's certain places that require, you know, a small level of tolerance between the stability of a crop, you know. So it seems like, you know, in some markets it's even more important because you might not be able to actually even sell your product because it's out of the range of what it's supposed to be, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, and like Colombia with ICA, it has to be
Yep.
within 10% variation to actually register the genetic for commercial cultivation. Spain, the registry there is pretty similar. And then also, looking at like Uruguay in South America, like they're also right in line with that, as far as, you know, if you want, this genetic isn't just, you know, it's not just a random mashup of three strains where you're gonna get 36 different phenotypes. It has to be, you know, everything that comes out of that seed line that you're registering has to be within spec. And then they don't care what season it is. They don't care if it's in a greenhouse versus outdoor. It's all got to be super uniform.
Yeah, that's wild. I mean, that's people's businesses right there. So if they're not, you know, focusing on that stability right away, it could be kind of a detrimental thing for them in the future. Taylor, you've mentioned this term before, and I feel like this would be a good topic for you to kind of discuss. How important is the chemovar profile? And maybe you could give a little bit of an explanation to our viewers of what that even means.
Sure. So chemovar is a chemical variety. So we've got cultivar, which is cultivated variety. People refer to those typically as strains in the industry, but chemovars specifically refer to the chemical, the genetics predisposition to what chemicals, right, it's going to produce. And we classify cannabis currently into four types. Type 1 being THC dominant, type 2s being balanced CBD and THC, and those can come in various ratios. Higher amounts of CBD than THC, or vice versa, higher amounts of THC than CBD. Type 3 is going to be your CBD dominant, or what people often would think of as a hemp plant, typically, low THC, high CBD. And type 4 is CBG dominant. So the chemovar profile is extremely important for the end user experience, specifically, well, whatever the outcome or the desire is, you know, it's going to dictate the effects and the medicinal benefits. So, as you know, Ben mentioned, as we talked about before, there's a lot of hype around high THC nowadays, you know, and people want the highest 30+% THC. That's going to have a very, minimal ratio of any other cannabinoid if it's got that much THC, and oftentimes less terpenoids or other flavonoids that could have the help with the entourage effect. So to me, the super high potency THC products out there lack a lot of identity, and so personally, I prefer chemovars that are more well balanced in nature when it comes to cannabinoids and the aromatic and terpenoids and flavonoids, the other compounds that add to the experience. And it's something that I focus on in my breeding, is trying to have a wide variety of chemovars so that everyone's a little bit different, right? So each consumer can have their preference. There's this old saying, the nose knows. When you smell cannabis, your body is either attracted to it or maybe not attracted to it. And you should listen to that. It's your body telling you kind of those compounds the plant's producing, that you want it or you don't want it. And everyone's different. So we may have similar likes. We might want that uplifting effect, often referred to as a sativa type genetic, or you may want the, couch potato, couch lock indica, let's call it, sedative effect. There's all sorts of other things and balanced nuances that come with chemovars. And so, yeah, to me, that's the Pandora's box of genetics, is the different chemovars out there, and all the different combinations of compounds. I mean, when we analyze cannabis, we're looking at 30 something compounds on average. And, we know this plant produces hundreds of chemical compounds. So it's extremely complex, and we've got a long way to go to better understand it and how it works.
Yep, absolutely. Totally makes sense. Kev, this one's for you. This one's a fun one. It's and kind of one that's near and dear to my heart, and super relevant these days. We got lineage versus hype, right? So obviously there's a multitude of genetics that have been circulated around the world for a long time, and accidentally hybridized, purposefully hybridized, but as the industry or the culture has evolved a little bit more, we're seeing a lot more genetics being bred for the purpose of this explosion in the market, right? The hype genetic. And not to say that the hype genetics aren't relevant or worthwhile or really freaking tasty, but what do you see as the difference between, lineages of genetics and the hype of genetics?
Well, without lineage, you can't have hype, right? So you're highlighting something, but hype is something that when people try to focus on it, they typically don't hit it.
Right.
Hype's a culmination of all things coming together simultaneously, and you're able to say, hey, the market has a desire. Someone introduces something that is going to complete that desire, and there's somebody who's highlighting it that lets it be promoted, right? And so now what you have is exposure, and then that's hype, and it drives forward. And then once it's moving, everyone pours into it so they can ride the hype ride too. And what they do, though, is they look back to see what hype was made from. What's the lineage? What are the plants used so that they can go in and start to maybe find their own variation or their own improvement? And so I think it's funny because what you try to do as a developer is not chase hype. You try to chase stability. You look for markets that have a known quantity consumed, and you're able to measure velocity of consumption, and you target products that fit those stable zones.
Right.
And then you start to notice where there's heat, things that are mentioned, things that are gaining like notoriety, but in small form. And you try to take a look to see, is that something that's going to pop? So like, I don't know, I've been touching a lot of stuff for a long time. Sometimes when you touch it, when I first touch certain plants, I'm like, ooh, this one's going to move because it has all the things the market demands right now. And then the thing is to try to figure out, how long do you think that demand is going to continue, and what's going to be the disruption that'll change it? And what it does, it allows you to know you can still work in the same gene pool and propel that forward, or you have to go to new lineage to understand where you think this next wave is going to form. And I think that's what makes it fascinating, because nobody really controls the game. Then I think it's the beauty of genetics in general. I think that the gene pool allows people to come out of horrible circumstances and shine. It lets plants come out of populations that in a million years you wouldn't have thought it came out of. It lets you work for 2 years in incredible populations and find mediocre results. Like it's the truth. And the more we use science to refine, and with marker assisted and AI marker assisted to understand better combinations and probabilities and more thorough, or big picture testing, you'll start to see the picture more clearly. But right now it's still people pop stuff out of closets that change industries.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still there. And so, when you catch hype, be grateful you're catching it. But I would say typically don't breed towards it, because by the time you get your product to be in hype's already declining, and now you're into something different. So you have to kind of, as a developer, you have to really look to understand what do people really want. And those desires of timelessness don't change. The presentation does, but the desire of the person is pretty similar. I want to be satisfied. There's only so many sub-markets you have to understand. And when you do, you're able to put development into those markets that are burgeoning, and less development into the markets that are waning.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And as someone like yourself who's been all over the world, collecting genetics, and I can only imagine what your library looks like. You've kind of gotten a taste to really see the full spectrum of what this plant has done over the years, and what we've also forgotten about what this plant has done over the years as well too. And I know there's a lot of people that have been consuming for many, many years, who are kind of hoping that some of these older genetics start to kind of make their way back into the market again. The nostalgic people like us who remember smoking this skunk from the early 90s and really loved it, or I really loved it at the time and probably would really love it again. To start to see these things make a resurgence back into the market again, which kind of leads me to the next question.
Oh yeah, but they change. That's the only thing, is that all things move. Genetic plasticity, even through TC with soma clonal variation, it changes. So like sometimes you just got to enjoy the living hell out of it while it's in front of you, and just know that it won't taste as good in 30 years, but it was great today.
Sometimes the memory is the best to keep.
Yeah, because that was real. It's just, that's the beauty of what we're in, is that you can't hold things in stone. They're living organisms.
That's true. That is absolutely true. And this next one's for you again as well too. Licensed versus public. You mentioned this a little bit earlier. There are scenarios where a genetic will be bred or developed for a specific person, for a specific market or cultivator, and then there's genetics that are, bred and developed that are, available to anyone and everyone who can purchase it. What do you feel is the difference, and where do you feel it's going to go in the future? I know there's a lot of licensing that had happened in like 2015 to 2019, with a lot of farms that maybe didn't have a big name. And then the breeder said, hey, here you go, I'll license you this genetic. You're working with me. Helped kind of propel them into the industry, because then their name is attached to a really strong, powerful name in the genetics. Where do you see that going in the industry?
Well, I think as you start to go into more commercialized cannabis, licensing is essential, because the brands need to have identities. And so if we're all growing the exact same product, it's just a commodity, you don't have a brand association. But once you can kind of peel away who controls that production, and it could be a number of licensing farms, it could even be small micro farms. So 5 of us micro farms could get together, license a product, our combined canopy equals X amount of pounds. That's what we sell. And it allows us to protect, not so much from like what people don't understand licensing. It isn't to take so that your neighbor who gets a copy of it and grows it, it's not so you're going to go over his house and have him peeled out of his crib and arrested. It's so that another brand or company doesn't take the work and sell it and market it and utilize it without compensation. Because the problem is, it's like, if it takes the number of years it takes to really do thorough work and to get things into production and get them through a sifting process that says this thing has value, it's real. So the people who do that should be compensated. And it's really about business to business protection. And I think that what you have to be able to do, like I said earlier, is that when you're doing releases, if people just understood that cultivating homegrown relationships, cultivating people to want to cultivate, participate, do their own work, it's like craft brewing, right? You had 200 breweries in 1978. Carter takes away the ban on home brewing. You go up to 10,000 breweries. So it's about getting excitement and interest in what we do, this craft. And if you silo it only into like licensing, then regular people can't get access. And so to me, you want to have as many people as possible play with the toys, but outlier plants that have, agronomic qualities that are phenomenal, and the chemovar potential is incredible, which means it's just basically a high producing bioreactor. That plant has a value to a brand and a company, and they should have the right to protect it. And if I want to use it, then I should pay them, right? And I used to do this. I would buy plants from people and say, let me buy it from you so that we can use it in production, and then you get paid and we bring promotion. So there's always a way to figure out the deal, but I think when people think licensing, it's about exclusion from anyone accessing it that isn't in the elite. And to me, like, that's the most detrimental thing you can do conceptually.
Yeah.
There has to be a full circle of who touches the genes so that you get the full circle of heat. If you want hype, you got to have access.
Yep, that's totally true. And I mean, the community and the industry was built on all of us working together. And this is just another way for a brand to help elevate another brand in kind of a more specific way. Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. So we've had a conversation about the cultivation considerations when it comes to breeding, talked about the grower expectations. This next part, which is, I'm sure, near and dear to all of our hearts, is really the consumer experience. Because ultimately, like we said before, breeding, as it is fun for us to do, we're really breeding for a consumer experience or the market experience. And so this first question goes out to Taylor. Taylor, this is something that we've talked about a few times throughout this is really chemistry and safety and the expectations that the market needs for a pleasant consumer experience. So can you give us a little bit of an insight to some of the most important aspects to these specific tests, some that are required, some that aren't necessarily required?
Yeah, I mean, and we'll go into more of this, I think, on that final webinars of the series. But as it relates to genetics, that obviously we talked about chemovars, and so that's going to be the foundation for the chemistry that you hopefully are, in the end, proving through an analysis, right? A certificate of analysis that you should have as a consumer for the legal product you're consuming. And so that's going to validate that the chemovar is what it is. It's either that high THC that you expected, or it's that nice balanced medicinal strain, or it's that hemp varietal. And then, some of the other concerns, obviously, from a safety standpoint, are going to be heavy metals, microbial contamination. We know, cannabis is a bioaccumulator. So when it's grown outdoors or in certain substrates with certain fertilizers that could have contamination, there's always risk there. And then, we talked about a little bit about resistance and, and those traits and whatnot. I mean, breeding for mold resistance, things like that's only going to help this side of things when it comes to the analytics of the final product.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Ben, this one's for you. I know this is something that we've discussed personally a lot, super near and dear to our hearts, bag appeal, right? Obviously, this is a super important aspect in the consumer experience. It's kind of the first experience that the customer, the end user, is going to be a part of. So for you, how important is the different aspects of the bag appeal, meaning color, bud structure, frostiness, as you see here?
Yeah, it's the art of storability is kind of what I call it. So it's like the marriage of, where genetics and, the harvest process come together, and then the storing process. So, handling of, half of it's growing it, the other half is actually getting it into the bag and having it in a sellable form at the end. We all know that sometimes it's the hardest part especially in large scale cultivation, to really nail down. And genetics play a huge role in that. I mean, we notice that, specific, terpene compound, like terpene, I guess, trying to look for the word, just like marriages of different terpenes together will help with storability. So, a strain that is, say, generally high in caryophyllene with a lot of deep purple hues in flower is maybe not going to be the best, as storable compared to something that's like a lime green, really bright, super light green, like almost platinum, that has, high, terpen or high terpinolene or high limonene that act as like antioxidants to keep from the strain from degrading or keep the bud from degrading as it, sits on a shelf or goes through compliance testing or the curing process. Yeah, that plays a huge role in just, what the consumer's experience is going to be when they actually get that bag in their hands and get a chance to look at it. Because you could have the prettiest flower on the plant, but if it's not handled well, or if it's not, if it's like a really dark, it's beautiful, but it's like in a dark, like OD green strain, when it gets to the end consumer, it still might smell great, but you're going to notice that color has changed and gotten, just a couple of shades darker.
Totally, that makes sense, and I think that's something that is heavily overlooked or misunderstood in the market. We think about, the color, the smell, this and that, but we don't really consider how long it's going to last in storage, and in certain storages, when the cultivator sells it to the distributor, to the dispensary, at that point it's up to the other person on how they store it and how they keep it and maintain that quality. And sometimes you don't really, I walk into dispensaries and they have this beautiful display of glass jars, but it's next to the window. And the window is just completely beating sundown on these jars all day, which looks pretty in the dispensary, but those jars closest to that window might not last as long because you have those chemical expressions that are actually changing the quality of the flower.
Totally. Yeah, I always recommend cultivators, so like when you're first starting, like figuring out the marketplace, is to like grow a variety of genetics, and then grow the purple candy gas, grow the traditional like green, like light green bud with a real fruity nose, and and some other ones in between, to really find what's going to work well for you in your environment. Because I know, trying to, like, if you're in a really humid area and you go for those kind of more purple colors in the bud, they're going to oxidize a lot quicker. You're going to get a lot more waste out of that product line versus like a lime green bud. So like kind of being able to try a few, and then also having that storability. So if you're like, okay, I have 100 acres that I'm growing, and I dedicate 30% to the hype purple candy gas, I should have another 30% that I'm going to do for a slightly later flowering, lime green bud with fruit nose, and then, another one that's, something in between. And you'll be able to have that purple candy gas, and you can sell it quickly in the market, bring that to market first, knowing that it's not going to last as long. And then, when spring comes around the next year and you've been sitting on your last season's harvest for, 4 or 5 months, you can then start breaking into the strains that have held up a lot better. Because like back in the day, we used to have barrels in the ground, essentially, is where you kept your
Yep.
stash. And there you would notice that certain strains, you would come back to it and it would be 18 months later in some cases, and it would smell as fresh as the day that you pulled it out of the cure bag. Like, there's just something there. Like a lot of like the older like papayas, Dream Queens, Green Cracks, those things just seem to like last and last forever. Even Blue Dream has great legs in the bag.
And it's funny that you mentioned it. I actually pulled an old jar of some papaya that I grew last summer out, and same thing. I was expecting it to smell as spicy as possible, but it was still so beautiful and sweet. Um, Makes sense. Kev, these next two are kind of a two-part one, right? And I feel like being Ganjier and really understanding how to qualify and quantify the experience that you're getting from, either smelling or consuming, the flower, how important is, understanding not just what the consumption effects are, meaning if it's smooth, if it's harsh, if it's got a beautiful smell, what the flavor is. It quick flavor? Is it long lasting flavor? Does the flavor change? And then how that translates into the effects, whether that be a psychoactive effect, a medicinal effect on the body. What do you see as some of the important things when considering the genetics for consumption as far as those traits?
It depends on the intent of the product. And so things that are highly volatile are dangerous to hold for time. So to like Ben's point about legs in storage, things that have an extremely lightly bonded molecular grasp leave the plant quickly. And so they're dangerous to hold for time, but they're ultra attractive if you're in a vertical, meaning that you can move your product through your production into storefronts quickly. So you kind of have to define like what's the limitations of the supply chain you're in, and it really starts to help you understand what you can and can't work with. So like for aroma, really what we want to know is the intensity of the aroma. How clearly is it defined by your nose at a distance? So you have like an ability to communicate with someone else a reasonable level of, hey, I could smell it at arm's length clearly. I couldn't smell it until I put it up under my nose. We would say that's two differences in intensity. The other component would be complexity, and it's how many layers are present. And just because it's multi-layered doesn't always mean it's better, but it holds better in a market for time because people get less bored with it. So things that are more mono-note, they have incredible spikes in popularity, like when orange was hot, it blows up, pure grape, pure lime, pure lemon, pure cherry. But it drops out pretty quick too. Grapefruit's a good one. You'll see it explode, and then people get satisfied, then no longer curious, it falls away, and they don't touch it again for time. So if it's red hot, you think it can move and it's mono note, you're having to do like risk mitigation of how long do you intend to move it, how much are you going to move. So all those things kind of go into the consumer wants what they want, but us as the producers and developers, you got to kind of understand how those factors fit in so that it's not really just one thing fits all. If you're a pre-roll manufacturer, you don't want highly aromatic cannabis. You want cannabis that holds the bonds through temperature, right? So the experience in the smoke is where they get the best value, not through the nose. Jar opening, we want high aroma. So once we kind of see that, it makes it a little clear. And smoothness and harshness, it's kind of like with tobacco. If people like a lighter cigar or a heavier cigar, if you drink whiskey, do you want a thick, heavy mouth or do you want a lighter mouth? Do you like it more like water or do you more like cream? How do you define your mouth experience? And individuals all have their own preference. So it's really about being able to define it and state it so that when the product gets moved into the system, people know, oh, this is for someone who likes heavy, full mouth, very, very thick and full in the smoke as well. And flavor takes you back just like your scent with olfactory memory. And it makes you turn on parts of your brain that weave you through your whole life. And so that's what's so interesting about cannabis is that since it's such a complex bioreactor, you can fundamentally create almost any aroma. And so there's probably, 1,000 compounds total. And those 1,000 compounds total can probably generate all 42,000 different terpenes because the two terpenes that are present in cannabis are the progenitors of all the other terpenes. So the potential is unlimited. And it's just really about where do you want to go with what you want and how to define what customers' expectations. Those things go along with chemotype in terms of right now, we can say this is true in 15 years, science will move it. But basically, aroma reflects original source of location. It lets you know the plant how to produce these metabolites to exist in a situation. Humans steered them, adjusted and moved. And so there's these relationships. And so typically when patients are consuming something, customers consuming something, and it's a floral, it's a lavender, they have an expectation of an ethereal effect because historically those things have been merged. And so the better the experience of aroma, the more you're intoxicated through aromatherapy, the more you're the mouth is triggered, the more you start to trigger all the sensors in your mouth, which are programmed to go for specific flavors. And then the combination of the cannabinoids woven in with that give you the totality of your experience. And that's what makes it tough, to where we can get within 95% range of reasonable recommendation, but there's 5% of the population that always fall outside that spectrum. They're the outliers, right? And so those are the people that you have to be able to help them start to identify what they like, what they don't like, what they found, what they didn't, the names that are connected. So now you can start to identify their pattern. And then once they have that pattern, now they know how to better purchase, and the people who sell cannabis know how to ask better questions to make that happen.
That totally makes sense. You hit on an interesting topic right there. The people that are selling it, right? And it seems like for a long time the market was kind of driven by, oh, this is the highest THC, oh, this is the genetic that everyone wants. But we're starting to see an increase of more of an educational component to that end user experience, to the dispensary. When you walk in, you can say, this is what I'm looking for, and they can help guide you along that path with the aroma, with the flavor, with the possible experience that you're going to have after consuming it, and with you, I know this is something that's near and dear to your heart. How important do you think that is to not just educate the consumer, but educate the people that are, in the middle point, the sales position at the dispensary or at the shops, that are providing these products?
Oh, it's critical. It's critical because in every facet of what we do, there's an expectation of a result. So you produce a product at the farm, you need to know how that rated, how it's scored, so that you can see what happens through its lifespan moving through the supply chain. And what that does is it lets you determine where there's issues, especially with international, which is what I do. I need to understand what happened in transit, what happened when it landed, what do we need to do? And so the ability for all of us to communicate with common language, it lets everyone just do their job better. And it's trying to simplify the whole process and not make it more complicated. And so you don't have to be a biochemist to serve your customers correctly. It's just that with all the biochemistry information, it's nice when a little bit of it is woven into your life, so that when they ask a question, you can say, hey, these things seem to form these synergistic relationships. And I think what you're trying to do is really elevate the full experience in a way that benefits the customer primarily, because they're the ones who drive the system. But for your workers, it's nice when they feel empowered and they don't feel under skilled in public presentation, which is brutal. You know what I mean? There's nothing like having
Definitely.
people beat you to death over your lack of knowledge. And so for me, all these things are the evolution. And that's why webinars like this are awesome.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
get conversations up. Yeah.
Yep. No, education is important, and the more we understand, the more we know about what the experiences we're looking for, you know. So before, we're going to have a Q&A in a second. I forgot to mention that if you want to type in a question for our panelists, there's a little Q&A button at the top of the screen. Just click that and feel free to type in a question for them, and then we'll read it out. Before that, I just want to let y'all in on a couple key takeaways. So, we've discussed a lot in this, and it's, I'm going to go back and listen to this over and over and over again, because I could have the same discussion with you guys a million different times and love it every single time. So a couple things that, we feel that are really important to take away from this are obviously to choose the genetics that have been proven in your environment, that you understand how your environment is going to affect the growth of this and the production of this, through hunting seeds or through clones from reputable suppliers. The second one, like Taylor mentioned, is chemovars vary in effect, right, and medicinal properties. And having a variety of genetics is super important for allowing the consumers to actually choose what's working best for them. And last but not least, quality flower has great bag appeal and offers consumers positive consumption experiences with different medicinal and psychoactive effects. So again, this has been an absolutely amazing panel. I could talk about this with you guys for days and days and days, but they're going to cut us off sometime soon. So I guess we'll move forward to the Q&A section. And while we wait to get a couple more questions in here, I'm going to go with the first one. This one's for Ben. So Humboldt Seed Company, how long have you guys been in business, and how many genetics do you have currently in your library?
Oh God. Well, in business, that's the easy question. We started, we actually like incorporated in 2001, but we've been operating in Humboldt County since, like 1996 was when some of the first seeds were planted, and grown, but it was just kind of like for friends and family. Like we really started our company like small. It was a neighborhood. It was to provide access to the plant for, so your neighbors could be, growing just as good herb as you are. And there wasn't, because back in the day, there was a huge just kind of need for access, like before there was dispensaries and before you could just, order clones on Instagram, you had to get it. It was all word of mouth. So it'd be like your buddy's buddy. And so we were that source for a long time up in the hills. And then the second part of that question, what was the second part? I actually forgot it.
Your library.
Oh, geez, the library. I couldn't even.
Trick question.
I used to say 2,000 different strains or different like variations, and then at this point, upwards of 6,000 to 10,000, just with all the international travel and just kind of work that we've been doing with different groups around the world.